The notes that we took over photosynthesis today, it's not going to be the same as if you were in class, but this may catch you up if you were not in class. So this is learning target B and C of Unit 2. It's about photosynthesis. The order at which we do some of these things is going to be not confusing, but we're going to leave some things out the first time through, and the second time through I think it'll make sense. But up here at the top, photo means light. And to synthesize something, the way we've been talking about it today, is to kind of make something. So photosynthesis is making something out of light. It's using light to make something. And so the definition that I'd like for you to write down is the process in which, or the process by which, light energy is converted into chemical energy. And if you'll think about yesterday's notes, we talked about how light energy is converted into chemical energy. And then later on, chemical energy is converted into cellular energy. This is that first step. This happens in the chloroplast. You can write that off to the side if you want. In the chloroplast, that's where photosynthesis takes place. And so we're going to write something in three languages. We're going to write this row is in one language, this row is in another language, this row is a third, and then all this down here is kind of in a fourth. And I don't mean an actual language like Haitian and French and I don't know, native Athabascan or something. What I'm talking about is that we're going to write the same thing over in 3 different times in 3 different ways. I'm sorry, 4 different ways. And I'm hoping that one of those ways or more of those ways, something clicks and it helps you remember. So this first one is a mnemonic device, kind of like PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, helps you remember the order of operations for math. This is cows go. Cows go. So CO stands for carbon dioxide. The W is water. The S is sunlight. The G is glucose, and you can tell it's a sugar. It's a carb because it ends in OSE. And then the O is oxygen. And so that's the mnemonic device at the top. The cows go stands for these words. This would be the way that we'd probably explain it verbally to each other most. And this is the chemical formula. And if you notice, light is over the arrow on this one because that's how we would write it in chemistry. But it's carbon dioxide and water in the presence of light gives you glucose and oxygen. And so again, that's 3 different ways of saying the same thing. Another thing I want to point out is over here on the side, the factors that affect photosynthesis. So the analogy that I gave in class was if you have a fire requires 3 things. It requires oxygen, fuel, and a heat source. If you can take away the heat or take away the oxygen or take away the fuel, if any of those run out or you take them away, the fire will die. And in a similar way, if you take away any one of these 3 things, which you see them over here on the side, the cows, carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, if you take any of those away, then photosynthesis cannot happen. If you decrease these or one of them, then the amount of photosynthesis that can happen may decrease. And if you increase all of these, then you may allow the plant to go through more photosynthesis. And in so doing, we'll make more glucose. So let's pause there for a second. Glucose, C6H12O6, or whatever the sugar is. In this case, it's going to be glucose. That is the goal of photosynthesis. The product, the prize product, is going to be glucose. Oxygen is a byproduct. You can call it a waste product. It's another product from that. But glucose is the prize. That's what we're wanting to get. So let's jump down here. Right here at the top, you've got a cell. And you redraw a cell, you can see this inside. You should be able to tell what that is. That's the nucleus. It's got DNA in it. You've got this stringy stuff on the outside that's got little dots all over it. That's kind of studded. It's got the ribosomes on it. That's the endoplasmic reticulum, the rough one. In red, you've got a mitochondria. We'll talk. That's just there for future reference. We'll talk about that next unit, next lesson. And then this is the chloroplast. That's what we're going to be focusing in on. So right here, you've got a chloroplast. It looks like a jelly bean with a bunch of green lines stacked on top of each other. We talk about it looking like green pancakes. And we're going to zoom in specifically on that. This is the chloroplast. So we draw that chloroplast much, much larger so we can see what's going on. And in reality, this thing right here, this is called the thylakoid. It's the green pancake stack that we draw when we draw it small. This would be all over the place. And you can look up on Google, just search thylakoid, or even chloroplast, you'll probably see these little things. They're all over the place. And then in between them is this area called the stroma. And if maybe you can think about it as like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. So the cytoplasm of the cell is the empty space, this empty white space. So the stroma is in between all the thylakoids, that empty space. And that's where this side of reactions are going to take place. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. This is the thylakoid. This is where light-dependent reactions take place. On this side, we're going to show light-independent. And let's talk about what those two words mean. Light-dependent means it depends on light. It requires light, which is why I wrote this. You can go and write that down. It requires light. This side is light-independent. It does not require light. It can happen in the presence of light, but it doesn't require it. So in the same way you require oxygen, but your body does not require carbon dioxide to breathe. You can breathe in the presence of carbon dioxide, but you need oxygen. So in a similar way, that may be a poor analogy, but this is the thylakoid. This is where light-dependent reaction, where those happen. And so we have a picture of the sun shining light down on the plant. In the plant is a cell that has, I didn't draw the cell wall on here, but the plant has a chloroplast in it. And then in that chloroplast is a thylakoid. So the light's going to hit that thylakoid. It's going to give it energy that it needs to make something. And so let's talk about this for a second. So the thylakoid is going to send energy-full molecules over here so that the Calvin cycle can happen. So it uses the light to make ATP and NADPH. ATP you should be familiar with. It's the currency of the cell as far as energy is concerned. NADPH is probably brand new to you, and that's okay. NADPH. If you want to look it up, search what NADPH stands for, and you will be happy to call it NADPH, so you don't have to remember that whole thing. NADPH has an H on the end, and that's a hydrogen, and it breaks off that hydrogen. I put a little bond right here, a little line for a bond right there. In the same way that one of these phosphates break off and make ADP, NADPH, this hydrogen will break off in the Calvin cycle, and it will produce NADP+. And if you remember back to physical science or chemistry, this NADP+, it wants to have that hydrogen back on there. And so it will get a hydrogen back on there, it'll get recharged and be sent back to the Calvin cycle. It'll lose a hydrogen, come back over here, energy from the sun will recharge it, it'll be sent back over. And the same thing with ATP to ADP. We'll get a phosphate popped back on there and go back over. And so it's this cycle that goes back and forth, or around and around. The Calvin cycle, let's talk about that. The energy that's being used from the ATP and the NADPH, it's losing a phosphate and a hydrogen. When those bonds break, it's actually making sugar, which again is the whole goal of photosynthesis. So it's making sugar. In that process, though, it is losing a phosphate and it's losing a hydrogen. So it will come back over here. Well, you should ask yourself, where does that hydrogen come from? The NADP+ comes in here. It needs a hydrogen to turn back into NADPH. Where does it get that hydrogen from? It gets its energy from the sun, but how does it get that hydrogen? How does that hydrogen get put back on there? Where does that hydrogen come from? And it comes from this H2O. If you were to take H2O and use up the hydrogens on the NADPH, you would end up with just having oxygen, which is what the waste product is here. So water comes into the thylakoid, sunlight's energy come into the thylakoid, and it takes it takes water, and it breaks it apart, puts the hydrogen on NADP+, turns it into NADPH, and sends it over into the stroma where the Calvin cycle happens. And something similar happens. You think about ADP, we've already talked about it, ADP gets turned into ATP by putting that phosphate on there. So that energy is coming from the sun. Water's being broken down into that H and then this O2 gas, and then it's sent over here, and in the Calvin cycle, sugar is being made, and it's getting that carbon and that oxygen from the carbon dioxide. So Calvin cycle makes sugar, it uses up carbon dioxide, and then it's just a constant cycle back and around and around and around. If you look over here at the notes, that's kind of verbally, we'll explain, or in writing, explain what we talked about verbally. It requires light. It breaks down the water. The waste product is oxygen. Where does this happen? It happens in the thylakoid. These light-dependent reactions happen in the thylakoid. And it turns NADP plus and ADP, turns these two things into ATP and NADPH. And then over here again, verbally, we've explained it, but in written form, it doesn't require light. CO2 is used to make sugar. And energy where does energy come from? Energy comes from not the sun, because it's light independent. It comes from the ATP and the NADPH. And the where that this happens is in the stroma. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, I'd really encourage you, like always, go try to find a YouTube video, 3 to 4 minute video to try to explain this. I took a little bit more time this time, but hopefully that makes sense and you'll be ready for your quiz.